Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, Thursdays at 2 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we are going to continue our ever-expanding journey into the cultures of consciousness. I'm sure you're all familiar with the famous story from the Taoist Zhuangzi about the guy who wakes up after dreaming that he was a butterfly, and he asks himself, how do I know if I'm a man who dreamed about being a butterfly or a butterfly, now dreaming that he is a man? And this is, of course, a cute story, but it points to something that has always completely fascinated me, which is the way that we move between frameworks of the world. And we know this really well with dreams, where we're inside of a dream, and then maybe we even dream inside of a dream, or go into another world and then come back out of that world, and then there we are in our bed again, and that sort of relationship between frameworks it's always been really profound to me, kind of trippy, kind of strange, but also something sort of mathematical. And like a lot of people, I love the literature of Borges and Philip K. Dick, partly because they play with this sense of stories nested within stories, or stories referring to their own authors, and these sort of feedback loops that go on inside literature and inside a lot of mythology as well. I mean, if you're into this kind of material, there's a great book by Wendy Doniger called Dreams. What is that called? I'll pull it up here in a second. It's called Dreams, Illusion, and Other Realities, and it's all about especially in a lot of Hindu mythology, there are these dreams within dreams within dreams, and the whole sense of a life story is sort of compacted as one little unit inside of a larger tale, and the tale of 1,001 Nights is the same kind of thing. So I've always been fascinated by this stuff, and then this really piqued my interest when a book kind of crossed my radar called The Recursive Mind by Michael Corballis, The Origins of Human Language, Thought, and Civilization. And it's got there's one of those Russian dolls on the cover, and I'm like, yeah, this is it, recursion, here we go. And it turned out to be a fascinating book, and so we're going to be speaking with Dr. Corballis today on Expanding Mind about exactly what recursion is and what it has to do with the human mind, and I think you'll find it a most stimulating chat. But first, we'll bring on our co-host here at Expanding Mind, Maja Daoud. Maja, how you doing?
Hi, Erik. How's it going? Good,
good. Hey, do you ever like feel recursive? Like, God, I feel kind of recursive today.
It's a constant dilemma, really. Sometimes I just wake up all recursive.
No, actually, I kind of feel it when I could see myself looping through my behavior patterns sometimes, and I'll do a behavior pattern that I've already done for the day. Like I'll wash my hair for the second time when I'm taking a shower when I'm sufficiently distracted.
Well, it's funny that you
mentioned.
It's funny you mentioned dreams, actually, because that is when I do feel that kind of true recursion. Is when I'll awake from a dream and dream that I did something in my dream, and then I'll actually do it that day. So that's kind of to me, I can feel the impact of that recursion pretty strong in that sense.
Well, that's a wonderful thing in that film, Waking Life, in Richard Linklater's film, which is based on a real experience he had one time when he kept waking up from a dream, but realizing he was still in the dream, and it went on and on and on and on and on and
totally.
on and on. And so he made this film out of it, and it has that really remarkable sense of passing between frames.
Yeah, it was a great movie.
All right. Well, with that, we'll bring on Dr. Corballis, who's calling in from New Zealand. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. In Auckland.
I'm in Auckland. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. And I know we were kind of batting around the idea of recursion in a fairly loose way right now, and I think maybe There's so much stuff covered in the book, but I'd love to maybe have you help us define the term a little bit more, and then also, talk a little bit about why that started to be such an important thing in your own thinking about the origins and nature of the human mind.
Well, it really begins, I think, with language, because language is often considered to be an example of the use of recursion, and language is sort of defined by recursion in Chomskyan terms. And it occurred to me that there's more to recursion than language. So language, of course, embeds phrases and that sort of thing. And it's recursion that distinguishes language from any other form of animal communication. But I thought that recursion had more to do with human thought than being involved in language, because we're constantly embedding consciousness within consciousness. So, for example, simple things like memory, remembering what you did yesterday or what you're planning to do tomorrow, you're still in the present, but you have embedded in your present thinking past thoughts or future thoughts. And the other thing we do is we embed other people's thoughts into our own, so we can know what another person is thinking, or we can know what another person is thinking that another person is thinking, if you get my drift.
Yeah, so these are great examples, but I want to stay with the language a little bit more, just to be really clear about it, because for me, in a way, it was a little harder to see there than it was with these other examples, maybe because I'm just so naturalized to thinking inside of language. But when we say that language has a recursive structure, that we can embed things in it, can you give a good example of that, or just a kind of way to get a handle on that concept?
Well, here's a sentence. John thinks that Bill thinks that Henry believes that John should put his kids in Sunday school. And here's another one. Women think that men think that they think that men think that women's orgasm is different.
Well, that's true.
Now, of course, these are recursive thoughts, but language is being used to express them, and it's being used to embed ideas, if you like, within ideas. Now, I agree with you in a way that language is not, some languages are not recursive, it seems. For example, the language spoken by the Kruang, that's a group in Brazil. Apparently, they don't speak like that. They break it down into separate sentences. So I think recursion is more a property of thought than it is of language, actually.
Well, this gets into one of the things that you're kind of moving against is this idea in cognitive psychology, in linguistics, that there's something very specific about the break into language that defines the human mind, but that is often thought about even in terms of a kind of, genetic mutation. Or about something very specific about language and not about these larger recursive patterns that you're talking about. So I think it might be really good to understand what you are suggesting by putting it against the backdrop of some of the ways that language is thought about in terms of cognitive psychology that you find kind of limiting. Some of the whether talking about it with Chomsky or other ways that people emphasize the linguistic difference for human beings.
Yes, I mean, Chomsky is probably the prime example, I think, because his most recent view of language is what he calls unbounded merge, which is that you merge elements and then you merge the merged elements to create complex structures. And those structures are language, and that humans are the only species that do this, that have this property. It's a property really of infinite variability. I mean, there's an infinite number of things you could possibly say and be understood. So you need this recursive device to construct these things and to deconstruct them in understanding. Chomsky believes that this was some kind of mutation. He believes that it applies to language, obviously. He believes that it actually happened within the last 100,000 years, He's quite specific about that. That there was some mutation in some individual that permitted this style of construction and gave us this unique thing that we call language. And there's nothing really like it in any other communication system, so he therefore believes that it was some mutation that affected only humans.
And it's really it kind of would have to be just one person who suddenly
it would indeed
comes to life and goes, wow, I think differently than everybody else, and here, let me teach you how. It's kind of incredible the way, and yet the whole issue of where language comes from is kind of incredible.
Yes, I mean, I think that the thing, it's a bit momentous, you know. I mean, it's the idea that this one person had this rather momentous change in his brain that created this whole new way of communicating. I don't know how anybody else understood him, by the way. If it was a he, it might have been a she. Yeah. Since the idea is that this was a mutation that affected one individual and spread from there, and it happened like 70,000 years ago.
Well, let me ask you this, because this is interesting. If that was an isolated incident of recursion that happened only in language, because this is very interesting to me. To me, I think when things happen in us, they are reflective and even sometimes reflexive of other things in nature that exist in the universe, like in terms of microcosm, macrocosm. So if we see recursion in other systems of nature, like if I'm not mistaken, recursion kind of happens in fractals, right? And we can see it in things like seashells and leaves and things like that. So if there are recursive events in nature, do you think like that our language could have come from recursion in like relation to some of these things in nature, or do you really think that it was this completely isolated event in a singular human being?
Well, for that, I don't believe the Chomsky account. But there's another thing about language, I think, is that it's generative. That is to say, it's not just an isolated event. You're constantly using recursion to create new structures.
Right, right.
So it's got that generative component, I think, that makes language a bit different from the examples of things being embedded in nature, because it's used productively. You know, this sentence I'm using now is a new sentence, and I'm constructing it online as I go.
So you don't think that there's evolution?
One different thing.
I mean, if there's evolution and construction in nature, though, isn't it generative as well?
Does it generate an infinity of different structures? I mean, you can certainly see fractals and so forth in particular structures, but does it constantly generate new structures?
I mean, if there's new species, if there's new species being developed all the time, I mean, I would think that the answer to that would be yes.
But isn't it probably also that when you're talking about the generative qualities of language, it's sort of the on the fly and constantly productive quality of it that is being announced. I mean, maybe from some far perspective, you could look at evolutionary mechanisms and it would resemble certain kinds of generative patterns that we have in language. But in anything like our time frame, it's sort of amazement is just how productive and how many different directions it can go in, and the fact that kids do it they can clearly do it just as soon as they start talking. So it's not like they just repeat adults, and then at some point they start to become creative with language. They're creative with language from the very get-go, and so it's sort of like seems like an excessively generative kind of thing in relationship to other natural forms.
I mean, I think you mentioned evolution. I mean, new species have been generated all the time, but I think that's random. Mm-hmm. There are random changes that have been selected, which I think is not quite the same thing as generating a new sentence.
So you think it's random if, like, say, a bird develops a beak to catch a specific kind of bug?
Say that again, sorry.
Is it? I mean, I just think, like, I'm just being kind of devil's advocate here.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
I mean, is there randomness if an evolutionary development is based on a specific incident? Is what I'm trying to get at. right? Like, if you think evolution is selective and random, that's a perfectly acceptable thing. But if there are actual triggers that create that potential evolution, to me, I think it's the exact same thing that would happen in selective language development.
Well, I mean, a trigger or something happens once, and then, maybe you have a new species or a new development, but language seems to be different. It's continually generative. But I don't want to push this too hard because I'm not really a Chomskyan.
Right. Well, I was going to say, let's just that's a great way to kind of set it up. And then what strikes me about your ideas, you're kind of saying, look, let's not have it be this momentous genetic event that, among other things, drives an absolute wedge between human beings and other animals and forms of communication that we see in other places. But how can we understand something about language and kind of reflect backward and find out what other things might have been going on in the human mind, in human culture, and human behavior that would sort of set up the recursion that we see in language proper? And that seemed to be a lot of what was kind of motivating your research.
Mm.
That's right. I mean, I think one of them is so-called theory of mind, the ability to understand what others are thinking and to understand that others understand what you're thinking. And you can take that recursively to 3 or 4 levels, I think. And the example that I gave before, I can't remember what it was now, but Henry thinks that Bill thinks, etc.
Right.
And I think chimpanzees can do that to about 1 level. That is, a chimp, for example, can understand what another chimp can see and possibly what another chimp is thinking, but they don't quite take it beyond a single level of embedding. And I think language needs you to go another level so that if I'm talking to you, I not only know what you're thinking, but I know that you know what I'm thinking. And I think that sharing of thoughts, which requires a couple of levels at least of recursion, is critical to language. So if you like, chimps got halfway there. So you can kind of trace that line of thinking back into primates.
Now,
so that was one way I tried to kind of extend it beyond a miraculous mutation.
No, with the theory of mind, in order to lie, I need a theory of mind in order to lie, because I have to have an idea that I know that they are going to think that when I do this, such and such a thing, that they're wrong, but so that way I can get away with it.
Yeah, lying is a critical aspect, if you like, of theory of mind, I think. If you know what other people are thinking, you can fool them.
And then some animals seem to have behaviors that are clearly tricking in a way where you kind of have to have an idea that from their perspective they can't do this, and so that's some way in which there is some theory of mind inside of at least certain higher animals, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think there are examples of that kind of thing certainly in the great apes. Somebody collected a bunch of anecdotes from people working in the field, and the only convincing ones actually came from great apes rather than from monkeys.
Huh.
So there's a sort of notion that this kind of ability, this theory of mind thing, is something that did evolve relatively slowly, but it had to get to a certain point in humans where it could create language.
And part of that feature is that it becomes that it multiplies in some sense, that it iterates itself. It's like It's not just one, and you get that kind of embedding.
Yes, that's right, and you can get layers of deceit, if you like, sort of a runaway theory of mind thing that it can get pretty intricate.
Well, and that's a question I have for you. I mean, in your research, did you find that this kind of embedding of thinking, does that kind of part of language, is it conducive to reality, or does that tend to go off is it really like, if I think that you're thinking something that I think, is that usually true, you think, and reflected by language, or does it just go off into some like thought realm entirely?
I think language is really secondary to all of this. Language sort of depends on it. But this kind of thinking, recursive thinking, probably preceded language. So I sort of separate it from language itself. But we can use language to describe it.
So theory of mind is one of the elements that we have on the table, but there's a couple of other really important ones that you bring up, including the sort of account of gesture and what does that tell us about language, and so let's continue on the road.
Okay. The gestural theory is a little bit independent in the sense that that's not an argument about recursion per se. It's the argument that language grew out of gesture. It grew out of primate behavior, because primates have skilled use of the hands. So language really grew out of the ability of primates to grasp things. And so that eventually evolved into kind of pantomime. And then the final component, if you like, was the invention of speech. So I think language really grew out of pantomime, the ability to describe things by using your body. But it became sort of conventionalized so that you didn't need to actually create structures with your hands and body that resemble what you're talking about, but you could use symbols instead. You could use words. But that's a different story. I think that's a component of language. It's not the recursive componment. It's the descriptive component.
So another one, of course, then is time, and is how we think about the past and the future. When, in terms of like the origin of hominid species, when do people first start to think that there really is something like memory or projection into the future, somewhat along the lines that humans have now?
Yeah, but I think the time thing is utterly critical to language, because the thing that language allows you to do is to describe things that are not there, not in front of you. And so the concept of time, I think, was also a critical precursor to language, and was itself recursive, because you can embed past episodes in present episodes, or future episodes into present episodes, or even future episodes into past episodes. You can remember thinking that tomorrow I was going to do something. And I think language is simply a device for communicating about things that are not present.
Well, what do you think
I did yesterday.
In those terms? What do you think about, like, say, for example, bees that do a dance to communicate where a particular flower is located, which would have been based on a past experience they had, and also presenting something that's not in front of the other bees?
Yes, that's the best counterexample, I think, of a form of communication that depends on something that happened, in the immediate past.
Right.
But I think it's much more restrictive, obviously. So again, the generative component is extremely limited compared with language. But yes, I think that is a kind of example that probably evolved independently and in a much simpler form. But you're right. I think that's the one counterexample I always get.
Well, but again, even with that one, it's partly the nested quality in addition to just presenting something that's not there, like the example of remembering yesterday what I thought I was going to do tomorrow.
Yeah.
And even the way it trips up for language, and I was like, am I in the subjunctive or the Proust? It's a lot of complexity around linguistic complexity itself has to do with these hypotheticals, with conditional situations, with possible, situations. But it's that sort of again, that kind of feedback that happens that seems really really interesting. But the question I was thinking of right now is that, you know, obviously it's much more nuanced than this, but there's kind of a tendency you find in a lot of thinkers to kind of go one or two ways. One is that, like, language constructs the thought world we live in, that language is sort of the operating system or the software on which our mental operations occur, and the position more that you take that we have to see language as a device that exploits cognitive capacities and potentials that in many ways pre-existed. In terms of the field and how people talk about these things, how does that play out? Like, is one more dominant than the other? Is the kind of suggestions that you're making in your book kind of seen as sort of a little bit outlandish, or is it just kind of refining the relationship between those two things?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, actually, whether thought depends on language. And there is a sort of a fine tradition in philosophy that it does. And Chomsky, of course, is a bit like that, because he thinks that this mutation also gave us thought. You know, thought and language are the same thing. But I think there is another school of thought, which I suppose I must belong to, is that thought is different from language. We use language to express thoughts, but thought itself is different. So we can think about things without using language. But language is sort of embedded, that we can turn those thoughts into language. But sometimes we can't. I mean, some thoughts are probably too complicated for us to put into language. So that's why I think thought comes first.
Well, what do you think?
And thought has a complexity that language can sort of mimic if we want to describe our thoughts.
Well, this is very fascinating to me, and I'm just curious if through your research on this and that kind of, origin of thought, and I'm not sure what your feelings are on it, but, I mean, what do you think the implications of that are if it's true that the human mind is isolated from the rest of the universe in having this particular ability of thought? I mean, I know that's kind of a big question, but I mean, what do you think the implications of that are, that we as a species that developed this are isolated from everything else and are the only things that have this capacity for recursive thought?
Well, I think, as I was saying before, I don't think we're that isolated. I mean, I think there are elements of it in the chimpanzee brain. Mm-hmm. A certain amount of reasoning you can show in chimps. There's the famous experiments that Wolfgang Köhler did in the early part of the last century with problem solving in chimps, where they could apparently suddenly solve problems, mechanical problems, by thinking about them. So I think, I don't think we're isolated in that sense. I think you can trace somewhat of a continuum. Certainly, I think we've taken this recursive kind of thinking beyond what we see in other animals. Of course, it's pretty hard to test other animals, actually.
Like dolphins or something.
Yeah, dolphins, or chimps are the obvious one, or bonobos, because they are genetically closest to us. And there's a lot of work now, of course, trying to show that these animals do have thought processes. They can think about things independently of the present.
Right. I always love that they called the first chimp they taught sign language to Nim Chomsky, kind of making fun of Noam Chomsky.
Yes, that's right. That's still hugely controversial. I mean, people like Chomsky say it comes nowhere near language.
Right.
But the people working with chimps, of course, say, well, it's a step along the way.
Has Noam Chomsky ever sat in on any of those chimpanzee sessions? Do you know?
I don't think so. I think he probably dismisses them without even examining them very well.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, because you do spend a good amount of the time in the book talking about the issue of animals and language, and I also think that the approach that you're taking, while you're still insisting on some fundamental differences, is a little bit more has a little bit more continuum in it than some of these other really skeptical accounts of animal language. But it does seem to be the case, and I'm curious whether this looks the same for you, that the more people go into it and really have the idea that it's possible, that they sort of get a positive feedback on that possibility when they're actually in the situation. You hear from people who are skeptical, but are open to the possibility, and they say, "Hey, I'm going to go check it out." They go into a lab, they start working it out, and they start to see certain things that they can account for rationally. But there's also a kind of an affective development element that sort of enters in that's very hard to figure out, because on one level, as scientists, we shouldn't pay attention to it. But on another level, it clearly has a role to play in determining this question about what kinds of communication can happen. So I'm curious. I mean, have you gone and done firsthand animal studies or?
I have not. I'm not an animal psychologist, but I have good friends who are. And I think you're right. I mean, the big challenge now is to show that animals can do these things. And some of the most challenging work has actually been done with birds, which I think I probably go into a little bit in the book. The notion that birds do have memories of past events, and they do plan future ones. The caching of food is one example. I mean, birds have a wonderful memory for where they put stuff and what stuff they put where. And now there are people claiming they also have a memory of when they cached food. You know what I mean by caching, right?
Yeah,
hiding food.
Did you ever read any of the stuff of Irene Pepperberg with her work with Alex, the gray parrot?
Yes. I mean, I think Irene would say that the bird didn't really have language. It had concept formation and could answer simple questions about number and shape and so forth, but didn't really generate novel sentences in the way that we do in language. But certainly at a sort of receptive level and production level and concept level, that bird is pretty smart.
That's great. Well, we should take a break right now. It's a fascinating discussion. There's more to say. You're listening to Expanding Mind. This is Erik Davis and Maja Daou. We're talking to Michael Corballis, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Maja Daou, here with Erik Davis, and we're speaking with Michael Corballis, author of The Recursive Mind, The Origins of Human Language. And I really like some of your ideas, Michael, about how that recursive thought is not dependent on language, but rather might have been, there before. And this kind of begs to me the question, what are your thoughts about communicating those recursive thoughts about how, I think that you think something? Do you think there are communications that occur without language, like a spoken language? I mean, where does that put something like telepathy or the ability to know what someone else is thinking in that recursive sense without even maybe using a language to communicate it?
Well, I think we do it all the time, don't we? We have a notion that somebody else is thinking about, you or... I think we can sort of intuit other people's thoughts. I think that sort of happens in human society all the time, doesn't it? The way we sort of act towards other people and imagine they might act towards us. And I think that happens independently of language, but I don't think it's telepathy. I think it's sort of common heritage and, knowing where other people have been and what they've done. I just think we have a very good intuition of what other people think, but it's based more on evidence and experience than on any kind of telepathy. I don't want to go down the telepathy road, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Is it because you don't think that it's possible to communicate thoughts of each other's minds without language, that it's only possible through something like, say, because I don't really understand what the difference between intuition and telepathy would then be. If we know someone else's thought, but you don't think it's telepathic, do you think that's more based on, what would that be based on then?
Well, it would be based on partly the observation of people's behavior, knowing about their circumstances, knowing the culture that they live in, all those kinds of things, based on evidence, in other words, that's available to the senses. I don't think it's based on evidence that's not available to the senses and to one's memory.
So it would not be possible to have a recursive thought between two people if, say, for example, they weren't looking at each other?
Well, if you knew somebody was there, and know why they were there, even if you're not looking at them, know what kind of person they are. If you know the person well, you probably have an understanding of their sort of habitual thought processes and so forth.
Okay, but so then it would just be like you couldn't do it with a stranger then, is kind of more...
You would have more difficulty with a stranger.
Right.
Although
even you would have some
about
cultural contact. What kind of person they might be, what culture they're in, and so forth, I would think.
Mentalists are extraordinary at their ability to cold read, and so there you have strangers with similar cultural backgrounds, and you talk to people who are like, no, I'm not doing anything mystical at all, and they can extract enormous amounts of information from people based on how they hold their bodies and on things that I just don't understand. Looks like magic to me. But what's always seemed to be interesting, like besides the point about paranormal powers or whatever, is just that we use the phrase theory of mind. That we're operating on this theory of mind, that there's somebody else, that there are other minds out there that think in their own way, and that I can model that. But of course our experience of that is so intensely immediate. And I'm thinking about it particularly when, when we're in moments when we're not sure, like if we see something on the side of the road, it's dark, we don't really know, it looks like it's a bunch of rocks, and it might be a person, and then there's this sudden, person in the head. And it's so incredibly quick and immediate. And so when we talk about intuition, it always seems kind of funny when that we use the phrase theory of mind, because theory sounds so like, well, let's see, perhaps that thing over there that looks kind of like me is thinking sort of like me. But it's just so hard. It's just so hardwired. It's the immediate way we perceive our world.
Yes, when I say intuitive, I think a lot of this is sort of happens unconsciously. In other words, we don't quite know why our minds play up in this way, and why we sort of can intuit what other people are thinking. But I don't think that means that it's magic. That it somehow comes through vibes that come at us in some way other than through the senses. I may be wrong, but, it's hard not to be a bit of a materialist if you're a neuroscientist. Because
so then you would kind of place the origins of any thought then kind of really would be physically based on sensory perception?
Well, not only on sensory perception, but also on just knowledge of, common heritage, common experience, and so forth. So
you wouldn't really be, what about like a priori knowledge, like that Kant might talk about or something like that? That wouldn't really come in?
Oh, well, that's another sort of question, I think, as to whether this is sort of built into the brain from birth. I think the brain is structured to perceive the world in certain ways, and presumably to perceive other people in certain ways. Yeah.
Well, here's another question for you in terms of working in this idea that recursion is a feature of the way our minds work in multiple registers, how we think about, how we experience time and model time, how we make references, how we embed other minds into our stories about what our minds are doing, and that language is like one way in which that kind of manifests, or it's a tool that exploits those things. In our consciousness now, like in our minds, your mind, my mind, we're in this world full of language. do you think there are kinds of experiences that we have that reveal or sort of suggest this kind of recursive quality that are sort of outside of language? Like, where in our thought processes do we discover that recursive quality, outside of looking at language?
I think language really only skims the surface of people's thoughts, doesn't it? This is a point that Grice made. He was a philosopher. He said that really language only. What we're doing when we're speaking is we're scratching the surface of shared thoughts. So I think if you really look at what people say and what they're communicating, there's a big difference. So hidden underneath a conversation, there's a whole lot of common thoughts between the two people having the conversation. If you did listen to a couple of teenagers speaking, they say, that was cool, right? That's all they say. But what they're talking about is some shared experience that both of them know. So I think a lot of language is like that. It's just a sort of tip of the iceberg of shared thinking. And that shared thinking, of course, is theory of mind, really. It's knowing what the other person is thinking. And all I need to say to tap that line of thought is something quite simple.
So why do you think there's such an emphasis on language as being constitutive of everything? I think there's been this sort of tendency to just say, look, it's all about language. Language structures the whole thing. And I think a lot of people just looking at behavior, and especially if you start to meditate, and there's these incredible worlds of modes of consciousness, which, yes, you can language to some degree, but there's so much of life that seems to be, or our minds that seem to be, as you say, the language is just skirting on top of it. And yet, because we read books and write articles in order to explain how things are, it seems that there is a sort of imbalance in our self-understanding, both in psychology and in other fields, in terms of the central role of specifically human language.
I'm with you all the way there. I think, as I say, language flips across the surface a lot of it. We do try to go deeper, of course, but the fact that we're trying to go deeper means that there's something deeper there. Right?
Yeah. Very much so. And so...
that's what... Oh, sorry, Eric. That thought that there's something deeper there. That's why... because I really am interested in, origins and sources of things, right? So that depth that you're talking about is really kind of what it's all getting at, right? If there is this deeper thing operating, I'm kind of interested in, what do you think is that origin of thought? Is it strictly a neurobiological occurrence that... obviously that's something that no one really knows the answer of that. But, in your research for the book, I know you deal with, the origin of language and stuff, but what would you say is that origin of recursive thought? I know you mentioned you're not really down with the Chomsky thing per se, so, where would you put it at?
Well, I think it's social. I think probably the thing that drove human evolution was having to develop social patterns to survive in a dangerous environment. The primates are sort of tree-dwelling creatures who had a certain amount of safety within the sort of forest canopy. But when things changed and the forest canopy kind of retreated, humans were there stuck on a sort of African savanna, having to survive with a whole bunch of nasty cats, lions, and their predecessors. So what the survival mode was to develop highly skilled means of communication and social understanding. So I think really at heart, it's probably social. And a lot of it is sort of unconscious, knowing what other people are thinking and how they might react and so forth. So I think the core lies there somewhere. It's kind of hard to describe, but so people have called it the sort of cognitive niche, that humans had to be socially smart in order to survive. And of course they had to be materially smart as well. We've constructed all sorts of material things, weapons, and the whole material world we've structured around us has to do with survival in an otherwise unsurvivable environment, I think.
Well, here's a question for you. One of the things you deal with in the book when you talk about the history of hominids and when we might see these recursive patterns emerging, when do they start to kind of kick into gear? You know, there are these questions about why do we see certain things in Africa, 70,000 years ago and not till Europe till 40,000 years ago. And then, of course, what happens in the Neolithic? Why do things take off the way they do? And I'm curious, you can come up with, let's say, explanations that have to do with the conditions of life, with scarcity, with weather, with local grains, with kind of like the way that Jared Diamond does. But I'm curious, because there's something sort of, how to say this, mathematical about recursion, that you can chart these things, that you can create algorithms that kind of describe the behavior of some of these nested systems. Do you ever think about the possibility that some of these recursive processes, once they're set in motion, they have their own kind of mathematical sort of breaking points or bifurcation points where things are just going to happen and complexity is going to start to feed back on itself? More and more minds are modeled. It forces language to change in certain kinds of ways, and that we might actually be able to understand how some of these explosions of creativity happen in a more kind of formal way rather than in a story about changing natural conditions and things like that.
Wow, that's a big question, isn't it?
I know, it just came out of nowhere.
Yeah. Well, one thought that some people have had is that initially it was the sort of environmental conditions, dangerous predators, harsh climate, and all that sort of thing that led people to cooperate more and develop social structures to cope with this. But then there was another problem that emerged, another danger, and that was ourselves. In other words, people started to use the techniques to cheat one another, so that they began to be predators on each other, if you see what I mean. And that led to a kind of runaway recursion, runaway theory of mind. And if I can think more deeply about what A thinks about, B thinks about, C thinks about me, I kind of have an advantage. So people began to be predators on each other.
This is interesting too, because here I again have trouble with the distinction between humanity and another species. And even like you said before that you believe this origin of recursive thought in humans was out of necessity of socialization, but we know that happens in other species too. And then there is, of course, cannibalism in other species as well that deal with the exact same issues that you might be talking about. Like even in a lion pride, for example, right? That I think there would have to be quite a bit of recursive thought occurring between, say, like female lions that are trying to hunt a gazelle and they kind of communicate to each other. Well, because how do they know I'm going to go kill the gazelle and you kind of run it out of the bush or something like that? So so then what would be that like distinguishing thing that would have it happen to just humanity? I mean, even just like not talking about like maybe a Darwinian evolution, but just like, what do you think, like as a neuroscientist, what was so, I know you mentioned you think it does happen like with chimpanzees and things like that, but why to this degree in the human mind and not in other animal species that are met with the same challenges that we were?
Right. Maybe the challenge for humans was greater and more sudden. But all this is storytelling, as I'm sure you understand, that somehow it's sort of magnified in humans, but not that unique to humans. One thing about the human evolution over the last 2 million years is the extraordinary growth in the size of the brain, right? And that's sort of more or less unprecedented, I think. Primates have large brains, but there's a sort of progressive increase in the brain size through primate evolution, and on those terms, chimps and gorillas have large brains, but boom, then there was suddenly, within 2 million years, a tripling of the size of the brain. And that sort of suggests that there were challenges there that were kind of uniquely large.
Right, and then there's the whole argument about neoteny. I mean, it's the whole it's so peculiar that we come out like of our mothers half formed with these still bursting brains that go continuing on creating billions of connections for years, and we're instantly social and immersed into this social situation. So that link of a certain kind of social intensity with the peculiar facts about our brain seem pretty tied pretty deeply. But one of the interesting things about this whole question about the social role, which you emphasize as really being the sort of most likely realm of explanations for why our minds evolved the way they did, it's how hard it is to figure out, even though it's totally true all the time. But we still think we're like, I'm an individual, I'm going down, I'm making my decisions, I'm doing this thing, I'm thinking this, maybe I'm planning that, or I'm making another decision now. And then you start to do whatever kind of research, anthropology, psychology, all sorts of things. You go, God, and it's become so clear how incredibly embedded we are in these networks of intuition, of nonverbal communication, of cultural reproduction, all these things. And yet it's still really hard to not just think you're like a solo agent cruising along on your own, dealing with other people as you have to. But it's a really funny thing. So this is all just a way of winding up to, I'm curious how your research and your thinking along these lines has it had an impact on how you see yourself in your own mind as you kind of go about your daily life?
And I'm not sure where the question exactly was there, Erik. One of the problems, of course, is that most of this stuff is impossible to research in a way. I mean, you can't actually see what happened over the last 2 million years. You've got a few fossils to work on. You've got evidence that the brain increased in size. You've got neoteny, as you suggest, which may have been a secondary consequence of the increase in brain size, I would guess. And you've also got our nearest relatives, chimpanzees. That's going back 6 million years. So the rest of it's storytelling, really. And then you've got the sort of opposing thoughts that we are special, but we like to think we're special, don't we? And you've got a counter to that, you've got the sort of Darwinian notion that we can't be special, really. We must have evolved from other species. We must have common ancestry with chimpanzees and so forth. So you've got these sort of conflicting notions about ourselves. Are we animals or are we angels, And so, I guess one tries to sort of fill the gap in a naturalistic way, but it's a big gap, and there's lots of unknowns.
Well, it's kind of funny how you mentioned storytelling, that even at this sort of, this really important part of scientific research where it's like we're using our best tools, our best understanding of neuroscience and psychology and, anthropology to understand where we came from, that on a certain level, beyond a certain point, we're still just sitting around the fire telling origin stories.
We are.
And they're better, or they're different, but...
We kind of know where we came from, I think. I mean, with us, now we're pretty clear about the evolution of the species, but we don't know quite what happened and why it happened in that long stretch between ourselves and our common ancestry with chimpanzees. We know about the Pleistocene. We know about the increase in brain size. So we try to make a story out of all that, I think.
Well, Michael, we're going to be wrapping up here. I want to once again point people to your book, The Recursive Mind: The Origins of Human Language, Thought, and Civilization. Do you have a site online too, where you have other articles and things that people could check out?
I do. You'd really have to, I think, go into the University of Auckland website, and you can find find stuff there.
Yeah, that'll be enough. We're all Google-fied at this point. That'll be interesting for the future cognitive psychologists of the post-human race going, what did Google do to them? So
thanks for all the questions, by the way. You had some pretty tough ones there.
Oh, well, thanks. You were really good
and
sport
good fun.
in answering all of them so nicely.
Okay, great. Well, from Maja and me, keep your minds open.
Okay.